It's just 2 months since the Fijian Army's bloodless coup overthrew the legally elected government of Dr. Timothy Bavandra. Already it's increasingly clear that Fiji is sliding towards political, social and economic disaster. Because of the cane farmers' strike, sugar has become a black market commodity in a country whose principal export and industry is sugar. And the police say politically motivated crimes are on the increase as fear spreads throughout the community. For the past 2 weeks, Closeup has been dogging Dr. Bavandra's footsteps as he toured the world seeking support for his ousted government and as he prepared to return home.
I realized that I had been put in place through a general election and where I was given a mandate to look after the interest of the people that I represent. And it is on my part that I see it through, come what may.
Bold words from an embattled man. Just 3 months ago, Dr. Timothy Bavandra was an inexperienced, obscure opposition politician in a small South Pacific island nation. On April the 12th, he was Fiji's Prime Minister. Just a month later, he was locked up. After his release, he toured the capitals of the Democratic West, seeking support for his ousted government. The first stop was London to see the Queen. But Dr. Bavandra's initial audience was with the international media.
Prime Minister.
Your interest is on democracy. Democracy has just been demolished in our country. I think all of us will have to do our best to make sure that democracy is restored.
What do you hope to achieve here, sir?
Here? Well, my initial thing is to see the Queen.
Has she agreed to see you?
No word yet from her.
Went to Buckingham Palace 3 times. But he only got tea and sympathy from Sir William Heseltine, the Queen's private secretary. Within minutes of reaching Britain last weekend, Bavandra had been reminded that the diplomatic cold shoulder was invented in Whitehall. Keith Talking, Red Incident News, London.
British indifference was followed by American anger when Dr. Bavandra continued on to Washington, where the administration had been unimpressed by the Bavandra government's non-nuclear policies. Once again, the international media told the story.
The U.S. State Department has indicated it is not especially happy with the current visit to Washington of Dr. Bavandra. State Department spokeswoman Phyllis Oakley says some officials will meet with him, but she tried again to discount charges made by some in his party of CIA involvement in the coup. Dr. Bavandra will meet with some senators and congressmen who do believe there could be CIA involvement in the coup. He would like to see them hold public hearings on that possibility. Connie Lawn, Radio New Zealand News, Washington.
Hello, Dick.
Yes.
Johnny, Takuvula.
Back in New Zealand, Dr. Bavandra's supporters were discovering what he was learning overseas, namely that being Prime Minister may give you the moral high ground, but it doesn't count for much when you're trying to organise the practical details of a world tour. With no official government support, just getting travel arrangements can be very difficult.
About the plan, travel plan of Dr. Bavandra, the change, eh?
Yes.
You might have learned that he's now in Washington.
Yes.
And from there, he's likely to fly straight to New Zealand rather than Australia.
Right.
And then, but we don't know exactly at what time and what day. Probably towards the end of Wednesday or maybe Thursday.
Oh,
And they've got some new information about the people behind the coup. So that'll come out in Washington.
Dr. Bavandra's last stop before Fiji was New Zealand, where he was accorded the status of a VIP, though there was no official welcome.
We want Bavandra! We want Bavandra!
The most enthusiastic welcome came from New Zealand-based Fijians, Fijian Indians and their New Zealand supporters. But their hopes of seeing their hero were to be disappointed. Government officials decided that in the interest of security, Dr. Bavandra and his wife should be whisked away from their plane without going into the terminal to talk to their supporters.
Are we headed towards some sort of ultimate Fijian nightmare?
But while in Wellington, Dr. Bavandra was able to catch up on news from home.
By we talking to the Colonel, what does that mean? Who are we? The Alliance Party?
Though I understand a
No,
number of
definitely
legal
not the people of
obstacles
Fiji.
faced in the way of the Governor-General.
Closeup sought his reaction to recent interviews given by the former Prime Minister, Ratu Sekamasesi.
I am afraid that is likely to be what's going to happen unless we take heed of what the Governor-General is proposing.
Well, what brought it on? It was the coup that brought the racial violence that came with it. It wasn't, racial violence was not there at all. There was racial harmony all along.
Enough people of goodwill amongst the two races too.
Where was the goodwill when the coup was staged?
As I've stated before, the egg is broken now. We cannot go back to the constitution in which we enjoyed peace and stability.
Why can't we go back to it?
What do you think of the idea of a republic, Dr. Bavandra?
Well, whatever it is, if it's going to be a republic, it has to be the popular view of the people of Fiji. It need not necessarily be just the Fijians.
The coup leader, Lieutenant Colonel Sitiveni Rambuka, was equally a target for Dr. Bavandra's scorn. But when asked if he hated or despised Mara and Rambuka, the deposed Prime Minister responded more as a sorrowful Fijian.
Well, it's just that I feel very, very saddened, being a Fijian, an indigenous Fijian, that two Fijian leaders now talking are only just talking about themselves and have completely forgotten what the Indian community has done into Fiji over 100 years.
Well, you've had a meeting since we met for lunch.
New Zealand's Prime Minister David Lange was the highest-ranking member of any government Dr. Bavandra met on his world tour. But since the coup, Mr. Lange had backed away from branding the military regime as traitors. His advice to Dr. Bavandra was to get home as soon as possible and start talking to Fiji's new leaders.
And Columbus wasn't there, he's gone back.
No, he wasn't. He'd gone to
Dr. Bavandra indicated he was willing to talk, but on his own terms.
These are things that need discussion and dialogue, and I would certainly be part of that. But I must be clear in how I get into that discussion. I must be clear on how I'm going to be part of the discussion.
So the door is open, but you're not yet sure whether you're going to step through it.
It's there, but I've got to be, as I said, I've got to be pretty sure on how I get on in there, because I am the legal government. They are the one who obtained power through the coup. I want to walk as a legitimate leader in a democratically elected government.
The day Dr. Bavandra left for home, he could have been forgiven for feeling depressed. In Britain, the government and the Queen declined to see him. He'd upset the Americans with charges of CIA involvement in the coup, while Australia's Bob Hawke was too busy with an election to see him. New Zealand gave moral support only. Perhaps his time could have been better spent gathering support at home.
I was at home, a week or so after our release, and I then assessed the situation at home at that time and felt that there was need for me to go out and to assess the situation outside. Because one must realize that Fiji is in the Pacific, surrounded by so many islands. It is in a strategic position, and therefore the implication of what was happening in Fiji was much deeper and wider than what most people feel.
The domestic implications of what's happening in Fiji are only too clear. Dr. Bavandra was returning to scenes like this, the result of a racist attack on an Indian community. And he would also see thousands of hectares like this, mature sugarcane which should have been harvested weeks ago. But Dr. Bavandra defends the Indian cane farmers' strike.
As I said, it's a matter of life and death to them, and that is, and it's also the only weapon against the guns, and which is the rule of the game in Fiji at the moment.
And this too was the power that Dr. Bavandra would confront when he returned to Fiji. The massive weight of thousands of years of Fijian custom and tradition. A tradition of chiefly rule which the coup had acted with swiftness to restore after a bare 17 years of Western-style democracy. For the past fortnight, international departure terminals like this all around the world have been a home away from home for Dr. Bavandra. But today, he's really going home, to Fiji. And while he knows that his welcome from his villagers and other supporters will certainly be warm, there's also the thought in the back of his mind that he could be rearrested by the Fijian military or even assassinated.
Oh, well, yeah, of course. I suppose that threat would be always there when a leader of my standing in the kind of crisis.
I feel so excited. I'm looking forward to reuniting with my children. That's the thing that I look forward to most. As to the other aspect of what to expect home, I leave it to God to decide. As it has been said many times by my husband, I have confidence in our people back home. We'll be landing on our own soil, which is the western region of Fiji.
While Dr. Bavandra was overseas, many of his supporters and ministers had been detained or arrested. There was a chance that he might share that fate.
I've heard so many news from back home about the possibility, and the more I hear of being rearrested, the more I'm determined to be back home quickly and see them.
Before leaving New Zealand, Dr. Bavandra's advisors welcomed Closeup's plan to film the couple leaving the plane, as they feared an assassination attempt on the tarmac and thought the camera might prevent it. But our crew had hardly begun filming when the police stepped in and ordered them to stop. Despite the close scrutiny of the police and a plainclothes army man, we secretly managed to film Dr. Bavandra and his wife waiting for their baggage inside the terminal. Later, our cameraman was taken away and questioned by the police, who then ripped the film from his camera. Fortunately, we'd managed to switch film magazines, so the film that was seized was blank. Outside the terminal, Dr. Bavandra was welcomed home by thousands of cheering supporters.
What's going to be your attitude now towards the Governor-General?
Well, as I've said,
After the break, we'll take a look in greater detail at life in the Fiji that Dr. Bavandra came home to.